Good afternoon, everyone. Just get used to the glaring light. So what I wanted to talk about for about 10 minutes is just to set the scene about the implications of the recommendation in the context of London's long-term surface access strategy. So I've got a number of slides, the first of which is just to set some context around the scale of change that we're dealing with. So a third runway at Heathrow would result in an increase in annual passengers from just over 70 to potentially up to 130 million per year. An increase in employees from just under 80,000 to potentially up to 130,000. And the existing public transport mode share at Heathrow for passengers, 41%. This is low for an urban airport and even lower for employees. So Davis predicts this mode share will increase, which is good, to 53%. But based on that prediction of the mode share and the demand forecasts, this would lead to a near tripling in the demand for public transport to and from the airport during the morning peak and an almost doubling in highway demand. The ban on night flights potentially increases demand in the morning peak for passengers by compressing demand into a shorter period. And about 50% of Heathrow passengers start or end their journey in Greater London. So the scale of what we have to deal with here in terms of what we have to plan for in terms of surface access is huge. This is the context to that growth. We're talking about something that will be delivered by 2030. There's a lot that's happening in London by 2030 anyway. Daniel's talked about the population growth, 10 million people by 2030. But we're also seeing an increase in employment as well, with potentially in excess of 6 million jobs. So employment increase, population increase. And by 2030, when we look across all of our transport networks, we'll have 5 million extra trips per day just because of this background growth. This growth places enormous pressures on the transport network. This is one of our crowding plots showing the underground. Black and purple are severely crowded or where there's an operational problem because we're operating at levels of crowding that are inoperable. So we've got, even with the investment that we're doing with the tube upgrades, with Crossrail, we're forecasting crowding again by 2030 because of that growth. So part of what we're doing at TfL is looking at how we respond to this by putting in place the proposals for addressing it by increasing capacity, things like Crossrail 2. You've got the same story on the National Rail network. Even with Crossrail, you've got certain lines that are operating at severely crowded levels or will be inoperable because of background growth, particularly those approaches to Waterloo, but also Crossrail coming from the west and the east. So even in the absence of this decision, these are the challenges that we've got to deal with on our transport networks if London is to carry on functioning effectively. When you look at Crossrail in particular, Crossrail hasn't even opened yet, but we're looking beyond that to what the impact in demand will be by 2030. What this is showing is the profile in demand with the bars from Heathrow travelling from the west to the east. So you can see how the demand increases, and you can see the capacity there, the seated capacity in yellow and the standing capacity in red. So by 2040, without Heathrow expansion, Crossrail is forecast to be operating at capacity because of background growth. In terms of the highway network, and Paul will talk more about this, the forecasts that have been produced by the Davis Commission show that by 2050, all the motorway links around Heathrow are forecast to be full, so red lines on this map. So we're dealing with a set of issues that require quite substantial responses. Not impossible, but substantial responses that we need to deal with if we're first of all to accommodate the growth that we're going to see in London by 2030, but also to accommodate the growth imposed by a third runway at Heathrow. Now, when you add into that the air quality challenge, so the assumptions used by the Davis Commission are already changing. So Daniel referred to the recommendations from the Supreme Court. We've got an ultra-low emission zone for central London that's going through consultation at the moment to be implemented by 2020. That will change the baseline. We've got the government's response to the Supreme Court ruling by the end of this year. That will have implications. So this will affect the position on NO2 in particular and the date for compliance, and specifically the location of the worst road link in terms of delaying compliance. And this is the critical air quality test. At the moment, the worst road link is the Marylebone Road. That will no longer be the worst road link because of ULEZ. So the date of compliance may also be brought forward in 2030. So as I've said, ULEZ significantly improves Marylebone Road in the shorter term, so it won't be the worst road link. The Davis Commission is not specific about mitigation. It doesn't deal with these issues in detail. As Daniel explained, partly because of the timing, and this is still changing. We've got the government's response to the legal process that needs to be borne in mind. The level of mitigation needed could be expensive and also transformational. It will require a much bigger public transport mode share than both Heathrow have today or Davis are predicting, and this needs to be developed into concrete plans. But also, there needs to be third-party scrutiny and validation of the assumptions to make sure all the work that's been done in relation to Heathrow expansion is consistent to the government's response to the Supreme Court, but also the requirements faced on us to deal with the air quality issues by 2030. And that means we need to be consistent in our assumptions, travel demand forecasts, and the approach to how we model and predict future travel at Heathrow. So the one criticism we have in the way that air quality and surface access are dealt with in the report is they're seen as two separate issues. They're entirely interconnected. How we deal with the air quality issue will depend on how we deal with surface access. So there are a number of basic issues to be addressed at Heathrow. So we are already investing in capacity that will benefit Heathrow, like Crossrail and the Piccadilly line upgrade. But by 2030, we know networks in London have to accommodate an increase in demand. That means much of that additional capacity will be full. Public transport mode share at Heathrow has to increase significantly to minimise the amount of additional car traffic. So more surface access investment will be required, over and above what's included in the current plans, particularly to the rest of London and to those catchments where we know there's high demand for trips to Heathrow but high car mode share. But even with this additional investment, it's not clear how the air quality requirements are going to be met. So much more work needs to be done in light of the government's response to the Supreme Court ruling, but also to factor in the proposals for surface access to make sure we can come up with a package that delivers the surface access objectives, but also meets the legal requirements for air quality. And we don't believe any of these issues have been properly addressed to date by the Davis Commission in their report. So, part of what they deal with in their response is they recognise this long-term capacity issue arising from background growth. However, the Commission declares that the expansion itself of an airport is not a transformative factor that will change the scale of these challenges. In other words, we know it's a problem, it's too big, it's a London problem, not for Heathrow to sort out, therefore London's government and the government will sort it out. So we know by 2030 we've got an awful lot of issues to address in London because of the population growth, and added to that the expansion of Heathrow that requires more investment in surface access. We believe the Davis Commission underestimate the surface access infrastructure that's required. The estimate could be anywhere up to 15 billion from the work that we've done. So much more work is needed to look at how we can increase the mode share, but also meet the air quality requirements. So we have conditions. The air quality condition is absolute. It talks about capacity should only be released, not built, released. So introducing the idea that you might build it but control how it's used until air quality demonstrates does not delay compliance with EU limits. The surface access mode share is flaky. It doesn't have absolute requirements. It doesn't make the connection with air quality and just talks about good words about increasing mode share. We need more than that. So in terms of the priority issues to be resolved, there needs to be a recognition of accurate background growth assumptions and the use of appropriate modelling tools against which Heathrow demand can be properly tested. The air quality modelling needs to be based on agreed background assumptions with the ultra-low emission zone in place and reflecting what the government puts forward in response to the Supreme Court ruling. And this needs to be an agreed approach with the authorities in London. There needs to be a transparent assessment of how plans can meet conditions. We need to understand what the other conditions mean for surface access demand. The ban on night flights, does it push more demand into the AM peak? What does that mean for congestion? Does it mean we can meet the air quality requirements or not? And as I said, the mode share condition is flaky, needs to be strengthened with targets that are locked in to the air quality work. Finally, we need to understand the impact of the additional freight, HGV movements, and the extra demand generated by development around the airport, and to make sure that's factored into the assessment as well. Thank you.